Welcome to lecture 3 of the course Mind and Brain. In this lecture we will discuss the identity theory. The general problem we are interested in is how does the mind fit in the physical world. We take a historical approach in this mind part of the course, and we already have seen 3 answers to this question, 3 views on the mind-body relationship, and all 3 are problematic. That is, we have seen dualism and idealism, and in dualism and idealism, science is not taken seriously, scientific reasoning isn't taken seriously, evidence isn't taken seriously, but they both take the mind very seriously. They both positions start with taking the mind seriously. And we have seen that behaviorism does take science seriously, but ends up with not taking the mind seriously. And of course, if we want a theory of the mind and how it fits in the physical world, we want to do both. We want our best method to provide us with an answer. So we want a scientific answer, but we also want to take the mind seriously. We do have feelings, thoughts, and emotions, and how do they fit in the physical world? That's our question. So we want a scientific answer to that question, while taking the mind seriously. In the last lecture, we looked at idealism, and idealism was a type of monism. That is, it says, no, René Descartes, you're wrong, there are not 2 substances, there is just one substance, and that's the mental substance. That was what idealists like Berkeley claim. Today, and in the next lectures, we'll take a look at another type of monism that says, well, indeed, there is just one type, just one substance, and that's the physical substance, if they express it like that. Most materialists, because that's what we're talking about, that the other type of monism, usually they don't express it in terms like substance, but what they do claim is, what all materialists that are realists about the mind claim, is that the mind is determined by the physical world. The mind cannot exist on its own, it needs a physical substrate, it needs a physical world. So they all types of monism, all types of materialism take mind-body supervenience seriously. That is basically claiming that the mind is determined by the body. I'll explain that later, of course. And then the first of the materialist views we are going to look at is the mind-brain identity theory. And that is an identity theory, so we need to know what identity is before we can look at this theory. So we look at that. Identity can have different meanings, the word identity, so we'll take a look at these different meanings and see what the meaning is of the word identity in someone who claims I am a mind-brain identity theorist. And then we look to the arguments in favor of the identity theory, and then we look at the arguments against it. We'll end again with a conclusion and a preview. In this lecture and the next lectures, we'll take a look at materialism or physicalism. In this course, we'll take them to mean the same, those terms, and they refer to a type of monism that says that there is one substance, hence monism, and that is the material or the physical substance. In our first lecture, we looked at substance dualism, and substance dualism was highly problematic because one of the reasons for it being problematic was that it cannot solve the interaction problem. The theory says the mind is a substance, it can exist on its own. That is what a substance is. The physical world can also exist on its own, and they do interact, but the theory also implies, if you look at the properties of those substances, that interaction is not possible. We can't understand how they interact. One way of solving that interaction problem is by trying to avoid it. So it's not really a solution, but if you are aware that substance dualism leads to that problem, you might try to avoid getting there by accepting just one substance. So there is just one of the two substances that actually is a substance, can exist on its own. Berkeley says that the mind, the mental substance, can exist on its own, and the physical world does exist, but it depends on the mental world. And we saw that he basically didn't reason properly. So, and on top of that, he also needed God in the end to keep the physical world from disappearing. So he had a proof of the existence of God, and for many people that also would show that the theory is untenable. But the strategy is, in some sense, of course, a smart one if you don't want to get to the point that your theory has a problem because you've postulated two substances and it's impossible to see how they can interact. Just get rid of one. That's basically what Berkeley did, and that's also what other monists did that we can classify as materialists or physicalists. So we're going to take a look at that today and in the next lectures. So there is, of course, this other type of monism that says, indeed, there is just one substance, and that's the physical or the material substance, the res extensa. And then, just like Berkeley, you don't have the interaction problem. You avoid that it is created. And in this case, you might also say, well, we might stay away from God to solve any problem. So let's try to do that. So it's called materialism or physicalism. You might say, well, materialism is the view that says there is matter and everything depends on matter, and physicalism might be broader. You might say, well, physicalism says that there are only physical things in the world and matter is made out of physical things. For all intents and purposes of this course, we'll say it's just the same. And there are many varieties of materialism, and we'll discuss the most important one, and we start today with discussing the identity theory. Before we look at what the identity theory says, and before we have a look at what identity, the word identity, means in the identity theory, we'll start by taking a look at a general assumption of all materialist theories, of all physicalist theories, that take the mind seriously, that says, yes, the mind exists, and we are materialists. And that assumption that they all accept is mind-body supervenience. So let's explain that first, so you get the general idea of what materialism is, and then later we'll look at one of the theories, and that is the identity theory. The philosopher Jaegwon Kim says there is a demand to materialism, or a general assumption that all materialist views share. So it's a demand in the sense that you can only be a materialist in the mind-body debate when you accept this assumption, this thesis, and that is mind-body supervenience. Today we will see that the interpretation of the identity theories of what supervenience means is that it is identity. And in the next lecture and the lecture after that, we will see that functionalism, that's the next lecture, and lecture after that is about connectionism, that you could say that they claim that it is not identity, but realization. So we have supervenience, mind-body supervenience, that can be interpreted as identity and as realization. Of course, we need to take a look at that, but later, if you go back and you study and you're here again, then you'll see that indeed there are these two interpretations of what mind-body supervenience entails. So let's first take a look at what supervenience is in general. So without looking at the mind and the body and its relation and their relation, just look at what supervenience means in general. Supervenience is a determination relation. There's one thing or one set of things and it determines something else. So sometimes I use an example with Lego blocks and a plan. So you have a plan if you buy some Lego toy like a fire truck, and if you use that plan to put the pieces in the right order, then you'll end up with this shape. And if you do that again, you'll end up with the same shape. Another example would be, so suppose you have a stack of sugar cubes and you also have a plan, just like a Lego plan or a blueprint for a house. But well, let's make it easy. We have a plan, and the plan is put 5 cubes on top of each other. Okay, so when you do that, you get a tiny tower. You have still you've yet another 5 sugar cubes, and of course you could use them to make another tower. So if you follow the exact plan, put 5 cubes on top of each other, you will end up with the same shape. So the shape is determined by the 5 individual sugar cubes and their relations. That is important. If you just have the 5 sugar cubes, they could be lying on the table like here, like the ones besides this tiny sugar cube tower. And if you have different relations, you can say, well, it's a cross. So the cross, the cross shape is determined by, well, the 5 sugar cubes and their relations, and those are different relations than of the tiny tower. But if you would have followed the plan we used for making the tiny tower, you will not end up with a cross, you'll end up with the same shape. So the shape is determined by the sugar cubes and their relations. So the shape supervenes on the sugar cubes and their relations. And the same would go for the mind. The mind is like the shape, and it supervenes on physical things and their relations. So without the sugar cubes, you can't have the shape. You need some matter to have the shape. And similar, it would go without physical stuff, physical building blocks, you can't have the mind. So the mind supervenes on the brain, we will usually say. So mind-body supervenience or mind-brain supervenience is this notion that the mind does exist. It's not a substance, just like in idealism, the physical world exists, but it's not a substance. Now we turn it around. The physical world can exist on its own. So you could argue that that is then a substance. And the mind depends for its existence on the physical world. That's mind-body supervenience, also known as the Star Trek assumption. That is, Jackman Kim has said, well, the mind-body supervenience, I can explain that by looking at the Star Trek transporter. And then you'll see indeed that the mind supervenes on, well, molecules or neural cells and their relations. So we have, say, a spaceship. In Star Trek, a science fiction series, we have the spaceship. On the spaceship there is a person, let's call him Riker, he's one of the characters from Star Trek, and he wants to go to a planet. Now, how does he do that? Well, in the series, they came up with the transporter. So he goes into a room, the transporter room. There's a big device, and he steps into it, and then he is transported to a similar room on the planet. How does that work? Well, it works as follows. So they make a scan of where all his physical particles are. So say we're looking at the molecules. So we're looking at all the molecules and all the different types of molecules, and you'll see where they are. So they make a scan, but in making the scan, they also rip him apart. But they write down, the computer writes down where every type of molecule goes. And this plan is just like our building plan for tiny sugar cube towers. This building plan is sent to the transporter room on the planet, and there they use molecules, just like a bunch of sugar cubes, to build, well, a new Riker, or they build Riker, depending on your intuitions here. So, and then he is transported. And that means that if you buy into that, if you accept this Star Trek assumption, then you accept mind-body supervenience, because then you say, okay, Riker has been transported, and it's not just the physical stuff that's been transported or something like that. His mind is also there. So the Riker on planet Earth, in this case, will have the same beliefs. Now, there is this second scenario in one of the episodes of Star Trek, the Next Generation. Something goes wrong, and they use the building plan both on the planet and on the starship to build Riker from a set of molecules. Just like we can make a tiny tower of sugar cubes on the planet and a tiny tower of sugar cubes on the spaceship, and you'll end up with, well, the same shape, a tiny tower of sugar cubes. So if you have this building plan for a human being like Riker, where all the molecules go, where all the sugar cubes go, where all the physical particles go, if you put them in that order specified by the plan, so this plan specifies the relations of these different particles, and if you build according to that plan, you'll end up with Riker. Where you do it doesn't matter, whether it's on the planet, on the spaceship, or somewhere else. You'll end up with the same shape and the same beliefs. So now we have two Rikers. And the question now is, do you believe that they have the same mental states? Just like they have the same shape of their body, the same shape of their brain, the same structure of their brain. Both brains are structured in exactly the same way, just like the two tiny sugar cube towers have the same shape. There are two different towers, but they have the same shape. There are two different Rikers, but they have the same shape. But do they also have the same states? And if you say yes, like the maker of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, he says Riker and Riker Star, the copy, or, well, the other Riker, have the same feelings for Deanna Troi, or in a relation, or Riker is in a relation with Deanna Troi, and, well, are they both in love? Yeah. Do they both believe they are the real Riker who has a relation with Troi? Yeah. And if you say yeah, if you say yes, then you accept mind-body supervenience, because then you say, well, we have this bunch of molecules, and if we put them together, if they have certain relations, so if you have these particles and their relations, so not just the particles like the sugar cubes in a box, like the molecules in a box, but you use those molecules to build a Riker. If you have a Riker, if you have a bunch of molecules that have these relations as specified by this building plan, then you don't only have the physical shape, you also have the mental states. the mental states, are also determined by these physical particles, these molecules, and their relations. So any two things that are alike in all physical properties cannot differ in respect of mental properties. That is, physical indiscernibility entails psychological indiscernibility. If you can't make a difference, except then that we have two Rikers, this is Riker 1 and this is Riker star, Riker 2. So you have two, but the other properties are all the same. Well, then they have not only the physical, then not only the physical properties are similar, but the mental properties are similar as well. They have the same feelings, the same emotions, and the same thoughts. That is the Star Trek assumption. And any materialist in the mind-body debate has to accept that. And here you immediately see that we are talking about materialists that do not deny the existence of the mind. So we'll look at that view later. There are some people that say, well, the mind doesn't exist. And that's kind of a strange view, right? So, but we'll take a look at that later. But here we're talking about materialists that are realists about the mind. Okay, so now we have seen what the general assumption is of any materialist view. That is also a realist view about the mind. That's mind-body supervenience. We're going to look at our first materialist theory. That is the mind-brain or mind-body identity theory. And in its name is the word identity. And before we can actually look at the theory, we need to know what they mean by the word identity. The word identity can at least have three different meanings. Personal identity, it can mean qualitative identity, and we can talk about quantitative identity, and it's only the latter that is what is meant by identity in the identity theory. So let's first look at personal identity. Those three meanings are related. Personal identity is who you are. So it's a question, you can ask a question, who am I, who are you? And then you give an answer and you talk about your history and the things you did and the things that happened to you, the personality traits you might have, things like that. So that's what a person is, what personal identity is. And that's not how identity, the word identity, is used in the mind-brain identity theory, even though, of course, it's persons that have mental states. So, in that sense, it is related. But that is not what we're talking about. We're also not talking about qualitative identity. So that's the second view, the second meaning of the word identity. And here it means just similar in quality. So it's similarity. So we are talking about two things, like an identical twin. We're talking about an identical twin. Those are two different persons, two different physical things, but they have very similar qualities. They have very similar properties. They look like each other. They even are genetically very similar. That's not what we're talking about. So it's like two brands of coffee. You have a expensive fair trade brand and a cheaper not fair trade brand of coffee. If you make the coffee with your coffee machine, you taste them, they both taste the same. They have the same quality, but they are different. So they are similar. They have the same quality to it. And then you say, okay, it's identical. Well, it is in the sense of qualitative identity. They are similar. You can't distinguish the fair trade from the not fair trade coffee. They both taste as good. They both taste the same. So that's also not the notion of identity that's referred to in the mind-brain identity theory. What they use is quantitative or numerical identity. So it's about number, and the number is 1. So if you say my neighbor is today's lottery winner, about how many people are we talking then? Well, just 1. So if you count the number of persons, the number of physical objects I'm talking about when I'm talking about my neighbor and today's lottery winner, it might look that since I have 2 phrases, 2 descriptions to refer to reality, to refer to this part of reality, it might look that there are 2 different objects, 2 different persons, 2 different people, but they're not 2 different objects. So 2 things are actually one and the same thing. 2 persons are actually one and the same person. So it's A is identical to B, and therefore B is identical to A. That is how identity is used in mind-brain identity theory. In a moment, we'll explain what the identity theory is. The main claim is that mental states are identical to certain brain states. They are certain brain states. And identity theorists will claim that this is true, and it's a discovery. So it's not a definition or something like that. It's not a stipulation. It is an empirical discovery. So you can say, well, it is a discovery, we have discovered it, or we are in the process of discovering it, finding evidence in favor of it. So depending on who you talk to, of course, the evidence is already in, or we have still to look for more evidence. But it's not a definition, it's an empirical matter. So whether the claim is true or not depends on the facts we find out. So if you claim that mental states are certain brain states, you're making an identity claim. You're making a claim about identity, and it's a claim about the discovery of something. You have discovered an identity in the world. You have discovered that mental states are certain brain states. You have discovered that my neighbor is today's lottery winner. So if you say we haven't actually discovered it, it's a hypothesis, but it's still something that you can discover. It is not something that is by definition true, because if it would be a priori, true, then Descartes would not have been a dualist. So it has to be a discovery. So we'll take a look at what the theory is in a moment, but we're now talking about what we mean by the word identity, and we're now looking at what we mean, what the implications are for the truth of identity claims. And especially when we're talking about things we discover about the world. We have discovered that water is identical to H2O. Okay, that's also an identity claim. Water is H2O. Water is identical, quantitatively identical to H2O. What does that mean? We have to look at that. Unity Place is one of the very first identity theorists, and he claimed mental states are certain brain states, are identical to certain brain states, and that is an empirical claim about an identity in the world. The question then is this a contingent truth or is this a necessary truth? And a contingent truth is a truth about the world. You claim something about the world, but it could have been different. So the denial does not result in a contradiction. So, well, my name is Hans, and my parents could have called me Hank. I don't know. So that's not a contradiction. You can't say, well, it's necessarily that your name is Hans. No, it isn't. So a truth that is not a necessary truth. So that's a contingent truth. So for all we know, it could have been otherwise. For all you know, I could have had a different name. So you could say warning signs in traffic are triangular. Is that true? Well, if you're in the Netherlands, that's true. But it's a contingent truth. It could have been otherwise. We could have made a decision to make them square or round. And in different countries, they have different shapes for warning signs in traffic. So for all we know, it could have been different. It's not necessary to make warning signs triangular. But is it true? Yeah, it's true. We have discovered it. If you go out, if you're living here, if you moved here from another country, then you have discovered that. So it's a discovery, it's true, and it's a contingent truth. Now, it's not a necessary truth. So if you have a necessary truth, if you deny a necessary truth, you do end up with a contradiction. So a mathematical truth, for instance, 2 and 2 equals 4. If you deny that, you'll end up with a really strange claim. 2 and 2 is not necessarily 4. Yeah, it is. Now, if we think about identity claims that we have discovered, say not identity like 2 and 2 is identical to 4, but identities like my neighbor is today's lottery winner. So we have discovered that A is B, A is identical to B, is numerically identical to B, then we used to think that it was a contingent truth because, well, someone else could have won the lottery. So you find that out, and it's not necessarily the case. If you deny it, my neighbor didn't win the lottery, then you don't end up with a falsehood, you don't end up with a contradiction. So we used to think about discoveries of identities. So in this case, in the example of the neighbor, you have discovered that the phrase Hans' neighbor and the winner of today's lottery, those two phrases refer to the same person. You have discovered an identity in the world. And then you make an identity claim. You say, Hans' neighbor is today's lottery winner. But it could have been someone else. And then you say, okay, an identity claim is a contingent truth. It's true, but it could have been different. For all we know, it could have been different. And it's not a contradiction to deny that. That is not how we think about identity claims anymore. So this is important. If you read these older texts about identity theory, then you still find that it is about contingent truths because we have discovered them. But these days we will say, no, it's a necessary truth. And that means now that it could not have been otherwise. So note that it's a conditional. Note that if we say, if we have discovered that A is identical to B, then it looked that it could have been otherwise. You might have the intuition that it could have been otherwise, that you could have discovered something else. But if you actually have discovered it, so you have not made a mistake, right? So that's why we're talking like this. If you have actually discovered that A is identical to B, then it could not have been otherwise, and thus you have discovered a claim, or you have discovered facts, and you use a claim that's necessarily true. Note that it's a conditional. If you have discovered that A is identical to B, then it is a necessary truth. Okay. This is due to the analysis of Saul Kripke. So he says identity statements are, if true, so if you actually have discovered it, so if they are true, they are necessarily true. So they're not contingent truths. So if you actually have discovered that the neighbor is today's lottery winner, then this is a necessary truth. This is now generally accepted, and the question is, how did Kripke argue in favor for this now accepted view? So if you look at Place, one of the first identity theorists, then if you look at his work, you'll see that he doesn't really explain it, but you see that the notion of the notion of truth of his discoveries of identity statements is that they are contingent truths. So if you have a posteriori discovered truths, then if that's a claim that contains an identity claim, so A is identical to B, water is identical to H2O, the neighbor is identical to the winner of today's lottery, things like that, then we used to think that it was contingently true, and now we say it's necessarily true. So Kripke argued against that a posteriori identity claims, if true, are contingently true. He agrees that a priori identity claims, that if those are true, then they are necessarily true, like 2 and 2 is identical to 4, that is a priori and is necessarily true. And he now also claims that if you have discovered, if you've actually discovered that something is identical to something else, then, well, the claim that you say that those two things are identical is also necessarily true. Okay. He says, we have discovered that the morning star is the evening star. And actually, it isn't a star at all. It is, we later discovered, the planet Venus. So there was this group of people that in the morning saw a bright light in the sky, not the sun, but they thought, well, it's a star, and they called it the morning star. They gave it a name, the morning star. They baptized it in a certain sense. They said, this is the morning star. Of course, they didn't do that. They didn't baptize, but there was a moment that someone pointed at it, and the morning star said the morning star, and this got accepted in that society. And there was another group of people that did something similar with a star, a bright light in the sky. They saw in the evening, and they called it the evening star. Now it turned out later that they both referred to the same object, that is the planet Venus. So basically we have discovered that the morning star is identical to the evening star and is identical to the planet Venus. There are no three objects, it's just one thing, the planet Venus, and it's also called the evening star, even though it's a planet and not a star, and it's also called the morning star. So in the old view, you might say, okay, we have this group of people that says that's the morning star, and there's a group of people that said that's the evening star. And you say, well, someone claims, but the morning star is actually identical to the evening star. And you say, well, let's look at it, and well, it could go both ways. So for all we know, we could have discovered that the evening star was actually a star and the morning star was identical to the planet Venus, or we could have discovered that the morning star was indeed a star, the evening star was a star, and the planet Venus was indeed a planet, and that there were three different objects. So that's the old view. So then we have discovered it now, and then we would say, well, that's a contingent truth. For all we know, it could have been different. And Kripke says, no, it couldn't. For the simple reason that those terms you use, morning star, evening star, Venus, or in another example, we have discovered that water is identical to H2O, so someone has to say this is water. There was this use of the word, the first use of the word, this is water, and we continue to use that. So there was a kind of baptized ceremony, you could say, to say, well, I baptize this stuff water, I baptize this. Nobody actually did that, right? But in the practice, it came down to a kind of giving a name to an object and sticking with it. Like when you baptize someone, you give someone a name and you stick with that. So it is what Kripke calls a rigid designator. Water is a term referring to something, and it keeps referring to the same stuff. Evening star refers to an object, and it keeps referring to the same object. That is a rigid designator. And that means that if we are talking about water, we're talking about the stuff in a glass like this. And then we discovered that it's H2O. And then you say, okay, so that's an empirical discovery. It is true, so let's assume we actually discovered water is identical to H2O. Water is H2O, and therefore H2O is water. So that means that it really doesn't matter where you live, water refers to that stuff, and you could not have discovered anything else. Because when we first said this stuff we're going to call water from now on, well, you were pointing at H2O. You could not have discovered anything else. You could be mistaken, that's something else. So if we have discovered that water is H2O, then it could not have been anything else. You might have an intuition that it could be something else because you didn't know it was H2O. So you're going to do if you don't know what it is, what the chemical structure is, then you say, well, I don't know, it could be anything. Well, yeah, but then you discover it, and then you say, well, I could not have discovered anything else. And if you then say that the word water can also refer to XYZ, where XYZ clearly isn't H2O, that is not just a different name for H2O, but it's a different chemical structure, then you're basically changing the language. When you and I use the word water, we refer to that stuff. And if you say, well, I'm going to use the word water to refer to XYZ, another chemical structure, other chemical molecule, whatever, then you're changing the language. We can use it. You can use the word water to refer to a mobile phone. This is water. Okay. Yeah. So in that sense, you can change words, but then you have changed the language. Okay. So Kripke says, well, if you point at the world and you say, I call this stuff water, I call this the evening star, and then someone else says, I call this the morning star. And if you then are pointing at the same object, if you have been pointing at the same object, yeah, then the only thing you can actually discover is that the morning star is the evening star. And if someone else has been pointing at the planet Venus and said that's Venus, then the only thing you can discover that the evening star is the morning star is the planet Venus. And if you point at water, and that is already H2O, there's always been H2O. And if you then discover that it's H2O, yeah, you could not have discovered anything else. So it is necessarily true that water is H2O under the condition that we have actually discovered it and did not make any mistake. Because, of course, you've done the thinking about science course, so of course we can make mistakes. We can make mistakes in discovering that the neighbor is today's lottery winner. That might be mistaken. But if you have discovered it, It's a necessary truth. And that, of course, is interesting because we are talking about the identity claim, where we claim that mental states are identical to certain brain states. And if place is right, if that is indeed an empirical claim supported by empirical evidence, that if that, then the claim is, if we have discovered that, it has to be true. Necessarily, not contingently. You could not have found out anything else. Now that we've got our concepts clear, we can actually take a look at what the mind-body identity theory or the mind-brain identity theory actually entails. And this addresses the fifth question in the book, the fifth chapter: is the conscious mind part of the brain? The mind-brain identity theory makes the claim that all mental states are identical to certain brain states. We already saw that. This was the claim when I briefly discussed UT Place. So let's take a look now at his claim, at his theory that makes this materialist claim about the mind. The mind fits in the physical world. How? Well, the mind is just part of the brain. The mind is identical to certain states in the brain. Now, this is called the mind-brain identity theory, and sometimes it's also called the mind-body identity theory, because then the claim is made that all mental states are identical to certain bodily states. So, and the idea then is, well, maybe other parts of the central nervous system might be also relevant to the mind, or maybe the rest of the body. So usually the claim is that all mental states are identical to certain brain states, but it could be that the supervenience base is taken wider than just the brain. But let's look at the mind-brain identity theory, because that's the general claim, the general theory here, if we're talking about identity theory in the mind-body debate. Okay, so talking about mind-brain identity theory, side note, sometimes the claim is made that it's not just the brain, but a larger part of the body that is identical to certain to mental states. States here, the word state is quite neutral. It's a variable. It could be an event, it could be a static state. Usually if you're thinking about a state, it's something that doesn't change, that's static, that's a structure or something like that. So it could be a structure, it could be a static state, it could be a property, it could be an event. So state is just a general claim, a general term for thing. So mental things, mental entities are identical to certain brain entities. Okay, so that being said, the word certain here is really important, because if you say that all A's are B, and if you make this numerical identity claim, this quantitative identity claim, then you also say all B's are A. So there are, of course, brain states, like the brain states of the cerebellum, and Jeroen is going to tell you all about that, but the brain states in the cerebellum are not part of the conscious mind. You need, of course, a cerebellum, and you need all kinds of brain states that are relevant to the functioning of your body, like the brain states that regulate your heartbeat, but you're not aware of the brain states, you're not conscious of those brain states. So those brain states do not belong to the conscious mind. They are brain states, but they're not mental states. So the set of mental states is smaller than the set of brain states. There are more brain states than there are mental states, and the mental states are just identical to a subset of all the brain states. So hence certain. So all mental states, all A's, are identical to certain B's. All mental states are identical to certain brain states. And it's only those brain states that are identical to mental states, compared to cows and animals. So all cows are animals, but not all animals are cows. So you have to say something like all cows are identical to certain animals. And only this group is identical to cows. So all mental states are identical to certain brain states. So what does that mean? So let's take a look at in more detail to the mind-brain identity theory. So this means that mental states can be reduced to brain states. So this is also called reductive materialism. And of course, if we're talking about mind-body identity theory, then we're talking about mental states that can be reduced to bodily states. So it is called reductive materialism, and usually the idea is that we think about the complexity of the world, the growing complexity of the world in terms of layers. So you have the lowest layer, the fundamental particles, and if you have a lot of fundamental particles, you get atoms, and then you get molecules, and if you have a lot of molecules, you might get a biological cell or something like that, and if you have a lot of biological cells, you have an animal, and if you have a lot of biological cells in a certain animal, you might have an animal with a nervous system. So if we add stuff if we make things more complex, then usually it's seen as a new layer. So we talk about new layers. And then you get the lowest level of the universe, the fundamental particles, then you get the atoms, molecules, complex molecules, you get biological creatures, and you get biological creatures with a nervous system, and you get biological creatures with a nervous system and a mind. And now, the mind, according to the identity theory, is just part of the brain. So that's not a new complex layer. You can reduce this layer to the layer below it, or at least part of that layer, to that part of the brain that is identical to mental states. Now, sometimes people interpret that as eliminativism. That is, you eliminate the mind. But that's not the case. On the contrary, if you say that a cow is an animal and animals exist, then you don't say, well, we've eliminated cows. If you say mental states are identical to brain states, then you have not eliminated the mental states, because brain states exist, because animals exist, and thus if you say, well, you can reduce that, you can reduce mental states to certain brain states, then people think, well, but then there's no mind. We've eliminated the mind. No, that's not the case. Reductive materialism is realistic, a realism with respect to the mind, because it's a realistic theory with respect to the brain. If you say A is identical to B and B exists, then you say, well, A exists because it's just another name for B. So if brain states are real, mental states are real. So take care that you don't make this interpretation mistake, this error in interpretation of the identity theory of reductive materialism that is made by a lot of people. So it doesn't entail eliminativism. But you could do without the word pain, for instance. You could do without the terms that refer to mental states, because the word pain refers to a brain state, a certain brain state, with all kinds of properties. And that means that you also can say that the brain state is C fibers firing. Then you say pain is identical to those brain states where the C fibers are firing. Okay, so if I then go to the doctor and say I have, and you want to say I have pain, well, you could do without the word pain. You can say, oh, doctor, my C fibers are firing. and then you get a, well, painkiller, you get a C505 killer. That's really inconvenient, so let's stick to the word pain, but actually you don't need the word. So you could eliminate the word pain from our language or from our practice in language. It would be very inconvenient and it would be kind of silly to do so, but it's just another name for the same thing. Just as if Tony is my neighbor and Tony is the winner of the lottery, today's lottery, then I can refer to him as Tony, I can refer to him as my neighbor, and I can refer to him as today's lottery winner, but I don't need all three of them. I never have to talk about him being the lottery winner or being my neighbor. I just can call him Tony whenever I meet him or whenever I talk about him. So you could eliminate those other descriptions. In this case, pain refers to a certain brain state, the brain state in which C fibers are firing refers to the same brain state, so we could get rid of the word pain. So we could get rid of mental terms, but we don't need to. So make sure that you understand this difference between eliminating the words and eliminating the brain, the mental state. So we can eliminate mental terms, but not mental states, because the mental states are identical to certain brain states, and those certain brain states are real. So let's put this in a logical brief structure. So if we can reduce a mental state to a brain state, to a certain brain state, so one mental state to one brain state, we identify the mental state with that brain state. Okay? Did we then eliminate the mental state? That is the intuition many people have. The answer is no. Why not? Well, if we say that A is the same thing as B, and B is something that exists, then evidently A also has to exist, and we did not eliminate A. So make sure you get this. What is it that we can eliminate? Well, we can eliminate the term. You don't need the term pain. You don't need any mental terms. But getting rid of mental terms, we're not really going to do that because that's inconvenient, but getting rid of mental terms does not mean you get rid of the mental states. Getting rid of the term neighbor, just we don't talk about neighbors anymore because we have other ways to refer to those people living next to you, like the person living next to me. If you get rid of the word neighbor, you do not get rid of your neighbors. So, and real eliminativism, that eliminates mental states. That's a view in the mind-body debate that says mental states do not exist. And then, of course, we don't need the term either. If you say ghosts don't exist, you don't need the word ghost because we never have to talk about it. And it is an empirical matter. So if you are a reductive materialist, you might end up with eliminating some of the mental states that we usually accept in our folk psychology, in our common sense psychology, in our unscientific thinking about the mind. We might have all kinds of mental states postulated in our folk psychology, and then the reductive materialist says, okay, so let's look at all these different mental states that are postulated in our folk psychology and see whether we can reduce them to brain states. If that's not the case, if some alleged mental state cannot be reduced to a brain state, then it doesn't exist. Because all mental states have to be identical to certain brain states. If you postulate a mental state, suppose, for instance, that you think that free will is a mental state. You can debate that, but if you say free will is a mental state and it turns out free will doesn't exist, that means you can't reduce it to a brain state. Well, then you have eliminated free will because you can't reduce it to a brain state. So the relation between reduction and eliminativism is the other way around than people usually have the intuitions about. Usually people say, if you reduce a mental state to a brain state, you have eliminated it. And that's not the case. The case is, if you have postulated a mental state and you cannot reduce it to a brain state, then you have to eliminate it. Then you basically say it doesn't exist. And that basically is a spectrum. So you look at all the mental states postulated by our folk psychology, by our everyday thinking about the mind, and then you look which ones you can reduce and which one you cannot reduce. And it might be that all mental states can be reduced and then they all exist. All the mental states postulated in folk psychology do exist. And you can say, well, it turns out after scientific investigation that no mental states that are postulated by our folk psychology can be reduced, and hence none of them exists. We have good reasons to believe, of course, that many mental states actually exist and can be reduced to brain states, like color experiences. They're correlated with activity in V4. Again, Jeroen is going to tell you about that in the break part of the course. So that means that we already have a lot of data in that show that at least a lot of mental states can actually be reduced to brain states, or at least there is a correlation found between brain states and between certain brain states and mental states. We'll take a look at that argument, whether that's an argument in favor of identity theory, in a moment. So it is a spectrum from reduction of all mental states to certain brain states, and therefore all these mental states do exist, to no mental states exist, because none can be reduced. And it's just an empirical question where we end up in this spectrum, either with all mental states being reduced and exist, and no mental states can be reduced and therefore no mental states exist, or something in between. Okay. We're making a historical overview of the mind-body debate, and the identity theory was the first materialist theory that also was a realistic theory about the mind. So back then, materialism and physicalism referred to identity theory only. These days, one can say that physicalism and materialism also refer to functionalism and connectionism, which we'll take a look at in later lectures. But in our historical overview, identity theory comes first. So back then, you could just use the word materialism or physicalism to refer to the identity theory, because there were no other materialist theories. Identity theory thus was called physicalism, and usually identity theory is interpreted as type identity theory, type physicalism. So let's look at that, and then later we'll see a different version of the identity theory that's not type physicalism. So assume that we have discovered that pain is C fiber firing. So you say a mental state, in this case pain, is identical to what? To which brain state? Well, to the brain state C fiber firing. So let's for the moment assume that we've discovered this. And then we say, how do we interpret this? Well, we interpret this identity claim as making a claim about identities of types, and therefore also of the tokens, the elements contained by these types. So let's take a look at a different concept, the notion of a sugar cube. We all have this notion, so there is this type of thing, this type, general notion, a concept, a set, and then you have the individual tokens. You have all kinds of sugar cubes. These are all tokens of the type sugar cube. These are all individual instances of the concept,
the general concept sugar cube. And of course I can't show you the concept of sugar cube. But all the sugar cubes together make up this type. They all belong to this set of this sugar cube. And the same goes for mental states. So every token, every individual state of the type pane is identical then to a token of a physical type, and that's in this case the brain state C fiber firing. So your individual pane is identical to C fiber firing in your brain, and my individual pane, my token of pain, is identical to my C fiber firing, my token of C fiber firing. So let's visualize this. So we have the set, the category, the type of experiences of blue. So there in this set are all the individual tokens of the experiences of blue. The concept refers to all these individual tokens, or the set contains all the individual tokens. So that's your experience of blue when you look at the sky, and your experience of blue tomorrow when you look at the sky, and my experience of blue is in there, and well, everybody's experience of blue is in this set. So we'll just say you have an experience of blue, I have an experience of blue, yeah, they belong to the same set. Or the concept applies to both. And then you can say, well, this is a type. The type contains all the tokens. Now, identity theory, type identity theory, claims that for every individual token of the experience of blue, you find, if you do the empirical research, that every individual token of the experience of blue is identical to an individual token of, say, activity in activity X in V4. V4 is part of the brain of the visual cortex, hence the V, it's area number 4. And we know that if you experience colors, then there is activity in that brain part. So there is a correlation between the mental state happening, experiencing of blue. If that occurs, if you have an experience of blue, then there is activity in V4, and it's a certain activity. Let's call that activity X. Okay, that's in you, that's in me, that's in everybody. So every individual token, the experience of blue, is identical to an individual token of activity X in V4. That is, there is this correlation, and the identity theory says, yeah, this correlation is explained because it's the same. It's the same thing. And then you can say, but that means that the set containing all these individual tokens of activity X in V4 is just the same as the set individual tokens of the experience of blue. It's just another way of referring to all these individual tokens. You can say, I have an experience of blue, or you can say, I have activity X in V4. It's the same. You can say, I have, I am in pain, or my C fibers are firing. You refer to the same process in your brain, the same brain state in your brain. And then you say, well, the type experience of blue is the same as the type activity X in V4. That's what you then claim. So that is what usually is meant by mind-brain identity theory. The identity theory thus is interpreted usually as type physicalism, as type identity theory. The claim is that mental states are identical to certain brain states, and that if that's true, that is an empirical discovery. It's not a definition, it's something that if it's true, we have discovered. So can we indeed provide arguments in favor of this claim, in favor of the claim that we indeed have good evidence to believe that mental states are indeed identical to certain brain states. What is interesting is that we have found loads of correlations between certain brain states and certain mental states, certain types of brain state and certain types of mental state. So, for instance, if you look at the experience of color, every time someone has an experience of color, V4 in the back of the brain, part of the visual cortex, so the outer layer of the brain that processes information coming from your eyes, then it's time and again that in V4 there is activity, and there's a difference between in activity between having, for instance, the experience of yellow and the experience of blue. So there is this really strong correlation between certain brain states or activity in certain brain areas and experiences we have. So that is something that indeed is an empirical discovery. We have discovered that if people have the experience of blue, then V4 is active, and we have found that it is active in a different way than when people have the experience of yellow. Okay. Correlation, of course, is not causation, and correlation also doesn't mean identity. But how should we interpret this correlation? So correlation is something you need to explain. That is, sometimes there is an actual explanation. Sometimes there is a causal relationship. If A always goes before B, then you could say, well, this explains the occurrence of this constant conjunction, as Hume would have it, is explained by causality. But of course, it could also be a coincidence, or A and B are caused by the same event prior to A and B, and A just takes a little time longer to occur than B. So there might still be a causal relation in some way, but not between B and A. They're both effects of the same event. So a correlation in itself doesn't say anything. It could be a coincidence. It could be a causal relation. Of course, if two things occur at the same time, they can't be each other's causes. So if a mental state, experience of yellow, and a brain state, activity X in V4, occur at the same time, neither can be the cause of the other. They either are correlated in an accidental way, or they have to be explained by a previous cause that they are both the effects of, or it could be the case that they are identical. And that, of course, is what the identity theorist would claim. Why would you accept this interpretation? Why would you say that it is identity? And of course, we look at another relation in next lecture that also explains correlation, but in a slightly different way. But that would also be supervenience. In this case, you say mental states are supervenient on brain states, and supervenience is interpreted as identity. So the mental states are determined by brain states, by certain brain states, just because they are certain brain states. Now, what would be the argument in favor of accepting the correlation as being indicative of the supervenience relation, and supervenience to be interpreted as identity? Well, the first argument is it is the simplest explanation. So why is it that there is a strong correlation of A and B, and already we ruled out that they cause each other? So causality is not the part of the explanation unless we're looking at a previous cause that both causes A and B. So how can we explain that A and B are strongly correlated? Like the experience of yellow and activity in V4, or a presence, so the feeling of a presence. So there are experiments being done that if you stimulate the right temporal lobe in a certain way, so there is certain activity in the right temporal lobe, then you experience the presence of someone, even though there is no one. So you could be alone in the laboratory, you know you're alone in the laboratory, the experimenter in a different room stimulates your brain, the right temporal lobe in that way, and then you have the experience like there is someone in the room, even though there is no one. So how can you explain this strong correlation? So take a look at something different. So the correlation of the appearance of Mark Rutte everywhere our current Prime Minister shows up. So that's so annoying, right? Everywhere the Prime Minister is, Mark Rutte shows up. What an annoying guy. Well, no, that would assume that there is a correlation between two things. You still might think Mark Rutte is annoying, but then the Prime Minister is also annoying because that's one and the same person. So the simplest explanation for a really strong correlation is, well, you just refer to the same person, the same state, the same event, the same thing, the same entity with two different phrases, two different sentences, two different descriptions, two different names. Yellow and activity X in V4. The experience of a presence and activity Y in the right temporal lobe. Mark Rutte and the current Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Those are just different ways of referring to the same things. So it's the simplest explanation of the correlation. That's one argument. The second one is related to that, and often it is misinterpreted as actually the same as the first argument, that it is the simplest. So the second argument is Occam's razor. That's a principle of parsimony, of postulating less entities in a theory. So Occam's razor says, if you have two theories that explain a phenomenon, in this case the phenomenon is the explanation that needs explanation is the correlation of the experiences of yellow and activity X in V4. How do you explain that? Well, do you really need two things, two entities? Or could you not postulate less entities in your theory? So to provide another example, so say someone survived an accident, then people might say, well, he had a really good guardian angel. But this person in a car crash had also a really good airbag, and the airbag saved his life. So then we have two theories. One that basically says, well, this person has a really good airbag, and the other one says he has a really good airbag because that's still there, and a good guardian angel. But what did the guardian angel do that the airbag didn't do? The airbag saved his life, and you can add the guardian angel, but there's no reason to do that. So Occam, who is famous for this principle, said, you should not postulate entities in your theory to explain something if you don't necessarily have to do so. And if you don't necessarily have to do so, and you have a theory that has postulated such an entity you don't need, then take a razor and cut it out. So in this case, you cut out the guardian angel because it does not have any explanatory power, it's not necessary, and then you'll end up with a more parsimonious theory, a theory with less entities that still explains why this person survived the car crash, because having a good airbag is sufficient to explain the survival of this person. And the same would go here. Why would you postulate and an experience of yellow and a brain state? The more parsimonious theory is that they're both the same. So you cut out an extra entity with Occam's razor, and you say it's not two entities, it's just one entity, and we refer to them with different phrases, with different terms. So Occam's razor is a principle of parsimony that says you should not entail in your ontology, so your list of things that there are, things that you do not need to explain the phenomenon. The phenomenon in this case is we need to explain the correlation between mental states and certain brain states. And then we see that if you apply Occam's razor, it's ontologically more parsimonious to postulate just one type of thing, that is the brain state, and you can refer to that with mental terms as well. So you only need the brain states to postulate in your ontology. Only brain states exist, but mental states, of course, do exist. They are reduced to or identical to brain states. So you don't eliminate mental states, but you eliminate additional mental states in addition to the brain states. It's not that they are something separate from the brain states. So you eliminate them, you cut them out, only in the sense that you say they are extra entities over and above the physical entities we have in our universe. So that's what you do. You do not postulate them as additional entities. A third argument in favor of the identity theory and of interpreting the correlation between the occurrence of mental states together with certain brain states as identity is the causal role analysis argument. To see what it is, let's look first at an example outside of the domain of the mind-body debate. Let's take a look at biology, and let's be really brief here, just so you understand what a causal role analysis is. So if you ask what something is, you usually give an answer in terms of what it does, what its causal relations with the rest of the world are. So that's very much in line with Charles Sanders Peirce's pragmatic maxim you've seen in the Thinking About Science course. What is a gene? What is a clock, for instance? Let's look at that first. What is a clock? Then you'll probably give an answer in terms like, well, that's a device that tells you the time. Okay, so that is a causal role analysis. It tells you what its function is, what it does, what its causal roles in the world are. What is a gene? Well, you give a similar analysis. You say, well, that is something that makes sure that, or that causes that features of parents are being inherited by their offspring, something like that. So Mendel, when he introduced this, he didn't know anything about DNA, and then later scientists discovered that DNA made sure that features of traits of the parents are inherited by the offspring. So that's what the causal role played. So DNA played that causal role of making features go from the parents to the offspring. So the conclusion then is, okay, so if genes cause traits to go from, or to be inherited by the offspring from their parents, and DNA is the thing in the world that does do that, then, well, genes and DNA is the same. DNA is genes, genes is the DNA. Okay, so that's basically what you then do. You conclude to identity. The same would apply to mental states. What is pain? Well, that's this unpleasant feeling that is caused by tissue damage, for instance, and that causes you to say, ouch. It's a causal role analysis. And then you say, okay, now we put someone in a scanner, and we scan his brain, and we put a knife in his foot, and then he says, ouch. So there is tissue damage, there's ouch. What happens? What do you see in the brain? Well, there's these brain processes going on, and then we say, well, that's brain state X, brain event X, brain structure X, where activity Y is going on, something like that. And he says, well, that is what plays the role between the input and the output, and maybe other mental states. And then we say, okay, brain is that brain state. So that's the conclusion of the identity theorist. So the brain state determines the mental state. The mental state supervenes on the brain state, and supervenes here is then interpreted as identity. Causal analysis argument in favor of the identity theory. Now, one of these arguments in isolation might not be that convincing to explain the correlation, but taken together, they make a really strong case, and that is also what Paul Churchen says, they make a really strong case for the identity theory. So we have empirical data in support of the theory. So basically what we now have is what we want. We have a scientific theory that takes the mind seriously, and that gives us an answer to the question how the mind fits in the physical world. It looks like we have a theory that satisfies both our criteria for a theory of how the mind fits in the physical world, that is, a theory that takes the mind seriously, and a theory that takes science seriously, and we'll end up with the idea that mental states are identical to certain brain states. However, people have argued against this theory. Clearly, reductive materialism, identity theory, is counterintuitive. So many people have tried to show that it is false. And of course you can understand that many of these arguments come from people that are still defending substance dualism. So let's take a look at some arguments contra the mind-brain identity theory. If you want to understand the identity theory, of course, you need to know what the word identity means. If someone says mental states are identical to certain brain states. We discussed that. I'll explain that at the beginning of this lecture. And of course, if you argue against the identity theory, you should be aware of the meaning of that notion as well. So you should have this analysis, you should be aware of the analysis of identity. And part of the analysis we haven't discussed yet is the idea, the analysis of Leibniz, of what it means to say that A is quantitatively identical to B. If we look at that, we will see that this analysis of Leibniz provides us with a strategy to argue against the identity theory. So let's first look at Leibniz ideas, see how that results in an argument, in a structure of an argument against the identity theory, and then see whether we can actually apply that strategy. Leibniz has formulated a law, which could briefly be stated in the following way, that two things, of course they're not really two things, but they are two things in the sense that you might believe that they are two things, but you find out, you discover that they actually are one. So two things, X and Y, mental states, brain states, water, H2O, my neighbor, the winner of today's lottery. Two things, X and Y, are identical, numerically identical, quantitatively identical, if and only if all properties of X, all properties of my neighbor, are properties of the winner of today's lottery, of Y, and the other way around, all properties of Y are properties of X, all properties of today's lottery winner are properties of my neighbor. Okay, so that means that if X has a property that Y doesn't have, or the other way around of course, then X is not quantitatively, numerically identical to Y. If my neighbor has a beard and today's lottery winner doesn't, then my neighbor can't be today's lottery winner. Right? So that provides us with a strategy. Find a property of the mind that the brain does not have. If mental states have properties that brain states do not have, then mental states can be identical to brain states. Or other way around, If you find a property that the brain has, that brain states have, but the mental states do not have, then no brain state can be identical to a mental state. So the conclusion then is, if you find such a property that X has and Y doesn't, then you have found a differentiating property, and that's hence a property, a quality, a feature that makes a difference between X and Y, and then X and Y are actually two different things. If my neighbor has a beard and the winner of today's lottery doesn't, then we are talking about two different people. If a mental state has a property, let's call it property Z, if mental states have property Z and no brain state has property Z, then mental states cannot be identical to brain states. So this gives us a very good strategy, very clear strategy to attack the identity theory. You just have to find one property that a mind has and the brain doesn't, or mental states have and brain states do not, or the other way around, and then it's exit identity theory. So we're looking for a differentiating property, a property that makes a difference between X and Y, a feature that distinguishes two things, that shows that they're not numerically identical, that shows that they're not quantitatively identical. Now let's look at some properties that have been suggested to be differentiating properties with respect to mental states and brain states. We will evaluate these suggested differentiating properties. So the question is, can we find differentiating properties? So we'll look at some that were suggested, but we take a critical look at them because we don't just accept any suggestion, of course. So let's look first at epistemic properties. Epistemic properties are properties things have with respect to how we know them. So episteme is the old Greek for knowledge, hence epistemology. You know this from the Thinking About Science course. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. So epistemic properties are properties with respect to how we know things. And the person who wants to say that identity theory is wrong wants to claim that the mind has different epistemic properties than the brain does. And that is, I think, true. We know the mind, you know your mental states directly. You have direct, immediate access to your mental state. If I ask you, are you in pain? You can immediately answer yes or no. If you are indeed in pain, you have direct access to your pain. You know this immediately, so this way of knowing it is direct. Do you also know what's going on in the brain when you're in pain? No. You need to have a scanner or something like that. And you have to go in the scanner and, well, you have to be in pain, or someone has to put a nail in your foot or something like that, and then you can see what's going on in your brain, and then you know what's going on in your brain when you are in pain. That is indirect access, indirect epistemic access. So the mind has the property of being known immediately, directly, and the brain, what's going on in the brain, is known indirectly via a machine. So they have different epistemic properties. So if epistemic properties are differentiating properties, then we can say, well, the mind has a property that the brain doesn't have. That is, it's known directly and the brain does not have this epistemic property. Hence, if we apply Leibniz's law, mental states cannot be identical to brain states. But is this convincing? Are epistemic properties indeed differentiating properties? And the answer is no. Why not? Well, that would mean that any discovery we make about identity in the world, if you find out that water is H2O, that my neighbor is today's lottery winner, if you find that out, you might argue that you have different ways of knowing that. At least for the water and H2O case, it's clear. We long knew what water was. The stuff you can drink, that's in the sea, that's in lakes, that falls from the sky when it rains, that's water. Did we know that it was H2O? No, that was a scientific discovery. We had to have tools for that, a machine for that, apparatus for that. So we discovered that water is H2O. So we have two different ways of knowing that. Aristotle didn't know water was H2O, but he knew what water was. So to discover that identity implies that epistemic properties are not differentiating properties, because then you could never discover something like that. Then you could never discover that A is identical to B when you clearly did not have the same epistemic access to A as to B, because if you have the same epistemic access to A and to B, once A is known, you also know B, and clearly that's not the case. We have discovered that water is identical to H2O. Water is H2O and nothing else. We have discovered that. Water, the way we normally use it, the word refers to the stuff we can immediately, directly see, observe, we can taste it, but do we know that this is H2O? No. Is it H2O? Yes. It is identical to H2O. Hence, epistemic properties are not differentiating properties, because that would imply, if epistemic properties were differentiating properties, that would imply that water is not H2O, because we know it in two different ways. And anything else we've discovered, any identity we have discovered, we would then have to say that's not an identity. So it would kind of be an a priori argument against discovery of identities, which is, of course, ludicrous. So now let's take a look at two intuitively more convincing properties, I think. And here you see that it's clearly coming from people having dualistic intuitions. So the idea is that you look for, if you say X is identical to Y, you look for a property that X has and Y doesn't, or a property that Y has and X doesn't. So you look for a property that the mind has and the brain does not, or for a property that the brain has and the mind does not. And a property that many would say that the brain has and the mind doesn't is that it has spatial property. It takes up a place in space. It's extended, as Descartes would say. And on the other hand, now we go to the semantic properties, mental states can have meaning. My thought is meaningful. It has semantic properties. Semantics is just that it has meaning. And then you say, well, but a rock doesn't have meaning. Just a brain, a lump of meat doesn't have meaning. Brain states don't have meaning. Mental states have meaning. So here we have two properties, spatial properties, that would be properties of the brain and not of the mind. Hence, they are differentiating properties. Or semantic properties that are properties of the mind and not of the brain. Hence, they are differentiating properties. And now we can reject these two suggestions at the same time because, well, this is merely an intuition. So the identity theorist says, no, if I claim that X is identical to Y, then I say that all the properties of X are the properties of Y and the properties of Y are the properties of X. So if I say that mental states are identical to certain brain states and these certain brain states have spatial properties, then I do claim that that the mental states also have spatial properties, and the other way around. If mental properties have semantic properties, then those brain states they are identical to also have semantic properties, and you just can't say a priori that mental states don't have spatial properties and that physical states cannot have semantic properties, because I claim that I have empirical evidence in favor of the identity of mental states with certain brain states, and thus the conclusion is that brain states can have semantic properties and that mental states all do have spatial properties. You, the critic, the opponent of the identity theory, just claiming that that's not the case is not convincing. You should show that. And basically, these are dualistic intuitions. So you need more than just making a claim a priori that spatial properties are properties of the brain and not of the mind, and that the mind has semantic properties and the brain doesn't. The identity theorist would say, I have evidence that shows otherwise. So you can't just say that I'm wrong based on your intuition. So these suggestions for differentiating properties all fail to show that the identity theory is false. So it looks very good for the identity theory. We want a theory that takes the mind seriously. Identity theory does that. We want a theory that uses the best method available to us to gain knowledge about the mind-body relationship. That is the scientific method. It's a scientific theory. It takes scientific data seriously. It has arguments in favor of it, and it now has rejected arguments against it. The arguments basically came from dualism, defenders of dualism. Now, there is, however, one argument that's coming from within physicalism, from within materialism, and that's the argument based on the possible multiple realizability of mental states. So it accepts the supervenience claim we talked about in the beginning of this lecture, but it argues against identity of mental states with physical states. So today we'll only take a look at the argument against the identity theory, and then next time we'll take a look at the materialist theory that accepts that mental states are indeed multiply realizable. So let's look at what multiple realizability is and see how that amounts to an argument that many think is convincing in showing that the identity theory is indeed false. But it's false in the sense that it is the wrong materialist theory. Okay, so multiple realizability means that you can make something, can realize something in more than one way, in multiple ways. So that's basically it. So take a clock, for instance. Clocks are multiply realizable. That means you can make clocks in more than one way and from different stuff. So more than one way, different stuff. So you can make a clock, you can have a gold watch, for instance, with a spring in it. So it has it is using a spring in its mechanics, and the stuff is gold. But of course, you could also make it from steel and have a spring in it. So the way it's made, the mechanics is still the same, but the stuff is different. So you can realize it in more than one way. That's already enough to show that clocks are multiply realizable. But of course, a sundial is also a kind of clock, and you could make that from stone and bronze, for instance. So you could, it's a different mechanics, and a clock using a pendulum is also, again, a clock. It tells you the time, but it's made in a different way. You can make this from wood and rope and lead, I don't know. So you can make clocks from different stuff and in different ways. The mechanics can be different. So that means that just is what multiple realizability is. You can make them from different stuff and in different ways. Liquidity, the same thing. You have water. Water is liquid. Well, water is liquid, but it's not the other way around, right? So you don't say liquid is water, because that would mean that water and liquidity is the same. Now, it's a property of water, and it could also be a property of gold. If you heat gold, if you raise the temperature high enough, then gold will melt, and it's also liquid. So you can make gold, you can make liquidity from water and from gold and from many other things. So you can realize it from different stuff. Water, on the other hand, can only be made from H2O. That's it. So liquidity can be a property of water, can be a property of gold, can be a property of oxygen. So it can be a property of many things. So you can realize it in multiple ways. Liquidity is multiple realizable. Water is just H2O, and H2O is water. So that's identity. So the idea is that if something is multiply realizable, then there is no reduction possible. Then you cannot identify the thing that is realized with the thing that realizes it. So liquidity can be realized by water, by H2O, but liquidity isn't H2O because liquidity can also be made from gold, Au, not H2O, but Au, and if liquidity would then be identical to gold, so if you say gold is liquid, then you say liquid is gold, and if you say water is liquid, then you also say liquid is gold. If it would be a quantitative identity claim, just like my neighbor and today's lottery winner, if I say today's lottery winner is my neighbor, then my neighbor is today's lottery winner. And if my neighbor has a beard, then today's lottery winner has a beard. And the other way around, if today's lottery winner has a beard, then my neighbor has a beard. So if you now say, if you would reduce liquidity to the stuff that makes liquidity, H2O, then you say liquidity is H2O, but you can also realize it from in gold, and liquidity is gold. But then you would say, okay, water is identical to liquidity. Liquidity is identical to water. Both have exactly the same properties. Then you have gold, which is also identical to liquidity. Both have the same properties. That would mean that water has exactly the same properties as gold. Then this would be a glass of gold. And then you say, okay, if that's your conclusion, clearly there's something wrong. What's wrong here? What's wrong is that you cannot identify liquidity with the stuff that realizes, that makes liquidity. So if you can show that something is multiply realizable, if you can make it from different stuff or in different ways, then identity of what is realized, the liquidity, with what realizes it, water or gold, cannot be claimed. It's not identical. So reduction is not possible. And of course, this might also apply to the mind. If the mind can be made in different ways and from different stuff even, then you can't reduce the mind to the stuff or the structure that makes it. They would be different things. So the question is mind more like liquidity? Can it be realized in more than one way? Is the mind multiply realizable? Or is it more like water? Can you just realize it in one way and then you can claim reduction? Then you can claim, well, the mind just is identical to certain brain states because only these brain states can realize the mind, and then realization just is identity. But if you can make minds in different ways, from different stuff and in different structures, just like liquidity, then you can't reduce it to that stuff you find in one instance that realizes the mind, because then that stuff is identical to other stuff that also realizes the mind. And if, well, clearly the idea is that these two materials or these two structures are not identical. They are different, just like water and gold is different. So let's take a look at that. Let's take the classic example. So philosophers always use pain and colors. So let's take a look at pain. In humans, if we are in pain, previously I said then our C fibers are firing, and I also have said it's way more complex. So let's make it a little bit more complex. what happens if we are in pain? Then our neocortex is active. So that's the neos is new, so the newest part in evolutionary terms of our brain that is active. And okay, let's now take a step back to the identity theory. Identity theory says pain is identical to a certain brain state. Here we have this brain state. That is, part of this really complex brain state is activity in the neocortex. Okay, so there's all kinds of other activity, but activity in the neocortex, certain activity of course, is part of that. So according to the mind-brain identity theory, pain is activity in the neocortex and these other parts. But the important thing here is that the neocortex, activity in the neocortex, is part of what's going on in the brain when you are in pain. Now, fish do not have a neocortex. Let's now go back to what claiming that A is identical to B means and what that implies for fish. If you say A is identical to B, numerically identical, then you say all properties of A are properties of B and the other way around. So that means that all properties of pain are properties of this elaborate brain state of which the neocortex is, activity in the neocortex is part. That means that if you have some other structure, some other stuff, then that cannot be pain. Just like if you say water is identical to H2O, then H2O is identical to water, and then all the properties of water are properties of H2O, and all the properties of H2O are properties of water. And now that means that only H2O can be water. If you find somewhere in nature Au, gold, gold is Au is gold, yeah, but if you find Au, then that clearly is not H2O, that's something different. So Au cannot be water. So if water can only be H2O, because that's identity, water is identical to H2O, and that means that only H2O can be water, then let's apply the analogy to the mind-brain identity. You say pain is identical to activity in a brain with a neocortex. And now we have a brain that doesn't have a neocortex. Well, it can't be in pain then, because it's like water and Au. It's different. It's not the same. And in order for pain to be identical to that, to activity in that brain structure, pain must have all the properties of that brain structure and vice versa. But then we have two pains with different properties. That is, properties here in human beings, pain is identical to a brain state in which activity in the neocortex is part, and of which that is part. And in a fish, if a fish would be in pain, the pain would be identical to, well, something that leaves that property out. So this is something that has a property that that doesn't have. So they can't be part of the same type. And we're talking about type identity theory. So the conclusion is that if the mind-brain identity theory in the type version is right, fish cannot have pain. And the question is, does only a human experience pain when they get a hook in their lip, for instance? So if you have a hook in your lip, I will bet money on it that you will be in pain. And I also guess that a fish is in pain when someone pulls a line with a hook through its lip. So I think many people think that it's not likely that only humans then feel pain and fish don't. So fish do experience pain, and there are empirical data that show that they display all kinds of behavior that is similar to our behavior. So what they did, there's an experiment where they put the acid you get from a bee sting in the lips of the mouth of the fish. And they had a control group, of course, where they just put some salt water in with an injection in the lip of the fish. So you both had this small, tiny hole. So they had a control group, and then the control group with no bee acid, a bee poison, was eating just like usual, and the other group, the other individuals in the group that actually got the poison of the bee, then they didn't eat for a while. Well, that's what we would do if a bee would sting in our mouth. Then we will say, well, okay, I'll eat later because it's painful. It looks like fish have behavior that's indicative of pain, but they have a brain that's different from ours. So the argument now is, if fish indeed can be in pain and they have a different brain structure, you can make pain in a different way than it's made in us. So pain is multiply realizable, and if it's multiply realizable, then you can't claim identity of pain with a brain state, with a certain brain state. So why should we believe fish have pain? Now, there are empirical data that show that if you do similar things to the fish that would be painful in us, that would cause an experience of pain in us and then cause certain behavior, we also see this behavior in the fish. And also it would be evolutionary quite surprising that only human beings can be in pain, or, well, other mammals with a neocortex, because then it would have developed very late in evolution via natural selection, while it is really convenient to have some alert system that shows you that something is wrong with your body, that there is tissue damage somewhere. If you didn't feel pain and you have tissue damage and you don't attend to the wound, then, well, it might get infected and you'll die. So it might be a very good thing not to eat for a while if your lips are damaged, because, well, you get all kinds of dirty food in the wound, and that could be fatal. So there are empirical data, there's these evolutionary consideration to say, well, we do believe that fish indeed have pain, and the empirical data, of course, being very convincing. But of course, you could be like Descartes and say, well, only humans have a mind. But clearly Descartes could not have any evolutionary considerations living centuries before Darwin did. So he could be forgiven for that. Well, how could the identity theorist respond? Well, you could argue it's not about the differences between the two brains, but the similarities of the brains. Then you can go look at a lower level, of course. You can look at individual neurons, or neurons that are firing when the neurons that are in the lip detecting the bee poison, or detecting the tissue damage, are how they respond, how they work. But it looks like that would be not enough. So you could look at what is the same and then say that's pain, but then why is our neocortex active when we are in pain? So that's probably not the best response. And then the question is, of course, can we actually find those similarities in such a way that if you say, well, okay, then we get rid of the activity in some way in the neocortex in humans, and we just keep the same activity that's also part in these older evolutionary structures that are part of the fish brain and our brain, and then we'll see whether human beings are still in pain. That's what you have to do. And the question, of course, is whether you can actually find those similarities, because you have to some way shut down. You have to first get permission to inflict pain on a human being, and also shut down in some way this neocortex. Well, I don't know whether that would well satisfy all the criteria you need to be able to do an experiment. The second response is, and that's a complex response, so I will not ask about this particular response on the exam. Of course, you're allowed to use it. So you could say the claim that we have been making as identity theorists, that is type identity, that you'll say all pains are identical to certain brain states, and these certain brain states are identical to these pain states, and that this set of brain states has to be all these brain states that involve activity in a neocortex. That claim is too strong. I can make a claim that my pain is identical to a certain brain state in me, your pain is identical to a certain brain state in you. Those brain states might be from different types, and then you could also argue that if a fish is in pain, the fish, that pain is identical to a certain brain state in that fish, and that the activity in that brain, or that brain state, is indeed dissimilar from mine or from yours, so they don't belong to the same type. And then, of course, if they are identical, then pain also, your pain, my pain, and the pain of the fish also do not belong to the same type. So then we only have token identity. You still have identity, but each and every individual mental state is identical to a certain brain state, and you cannot group together those states, those tokens. There is no type. And then, of course, that becomes really problematic because, well, I do believe your pain is quite similar to mine. I have no access to your mental state, of course. But if we talk about it, we describe it in the same way, and so it seems that at least our pains belong to the same category, and the same would go for the fish pain, because, well, the fish has different kind of pain, but it's still pain. You all classify it as pain, and if you then would be an identity theorist, then you say, well, all these pains belong to the same type, and therefore all those tokens of pain belong to the same type, and therefore also the states, the physical brain states that are identical to, belong to the same type. So you could get rid of type of those types, but that's, well, one, strange, because it looks like all your pain and my pain, all your pain and my pain belong to the same type, and hence our brain states should belong to the same type because of the identity claim. The same goes with pain in other animals. So is fish pain really not also unpleasant, for instance? Or the qualia not the same? So you could not group the fish pain together with our fish pain in a type. So that's problematic. And also, if you just look at human beings, then I think we are able to generalize. Of course, there are slight differences between your brain and mine when we have, for instance, a headache, but there are painkillers that work for you and for me. So apparently, we are able to predict what will happen based on generalization of putting your pain in the same category as mine and as all those people that actually tested the medication, the painkillers. So, okay, you couldn't have a science of the mind anymore. So that would be problematic, because you could not make, if you have a science, you have to have general rules. You find regularities. We have found them. We have found that if you have a headache, this chemical gets rid of that. Okay, and that's not just for you, that's not just for me. And if you only can say something about the mental states of an individual and what happens in that individual's brain, and that is different from what happens in my brain or a third person's brain or in the fifth brain, then you should say, well, I don't know whether this painkiller is going to work. It worked in that person and in that person, but yeah, well, we're talking about something entirely different when we're talking about your brain. Well, that's not the case. So we actually do have a science of the mind. We can make predictions like that. So it looks like the token identity response of the identity theory is a no-go. It's not something that's going to help the identity theory. One thing you could still do as an identity theorist, and that is something, well, I've planned for the work groups, but due to the ongoing corona crisis, I will see how I do that. But let me give you briefly what the argument, the response of the identity theorist here is. You could say, okay, let's look at this notion of multiple realizability. What does it mean to say that something is realized can be realized in multiple ways? So that you can make a clock in different ways, or a mental state in different ways, that you can realize it in different ways, in multiple ways. So if you analyze that, you can see, well, maybe if you look at the things that are relevant for the realization of a clock or of a fork or of mental states, then the question is, if you look at the properties that are necessary to realize a knife, is it the material, for instance? Well, not necessarily. Metal is a good way to realize a knife because you can sharpen it, but you could also use what they did in prehistoric times. You could use a bone and it would also cut. You could use, I don't know, copper. You could use, well, all kind of different things. What it is, it has to be firm. So you couldn't make it of Swiss cheese. A knife made out of Swiss cheese would not cut Swiss cheese, for instance. But a knife made out of wood, if it's really good wood, or metal, different types of metal, and you say, okay, so the stuff might not be that relevant. You could also look at it in that way. The stuff might not be that relevant. And then you go and look at, well, how is this with the mind? It also might not be the stuff that's relevant. So if you look at the stuff, if, say, silicon chips realize the same properties as biological carbon-based neurons, if they make units, neurons, chips, that interact with the same way, and it's all about this interaction, then it might be the case that it's not the stuff that's relevant, not whether it's made of silicon or of carbon. So the stuff is irrelevant. So if you're looking at multiple realizability, it's not the stuff, it's the properties that the stuff has. And then maybe the different stuff must have the same properties to realize the mind. So there might be so many restrictions on the way a mind can be realized that even though you can realize it with more than one type of stuff, material, the way you realize it is just one way. So I'll see how this will work out in a work group or a practical or a tutorial or a knowledge clip or something like that, where we go into more detail there. But the idea here is, if you say multiple realizability means you can make something in more than one way. What do you mean by more than one way? What's relevant there? If you get rid of the things that are irrelevant, you might end up with just one way. And then you still can claim identity of mental states to that way in which you make a mental state, because that's just one way. And then you can still say that's the same in fish as in human beings. And thus we can still claim identity, type identity. Okay, this was really not an easy lecture, I believe. So maybe one good thing of this corona crisis is that you can look at it again. So what's the conclusion for today, for this lecture? Okay, I think it's clear that the identity theory is based on empirical findings by science of correlations between mental states and certain brain states. So it does take science seriously. It also takes the mind seriously. It doesn't say a priori from the start that the mind doesn't exist or that we shouldn't talk about subjective inner mental states. It does say that if some mental states that are part and parcel of our folk psychology turn out not to be, cannot be reduced to brain states, then they do not exist. But the expectation, of course, is that most of our mental states we postulate in our folk psychology do exist just because we, of course, have access to them, empirical, epistemic access to them. We do know of ourselves that we have a mind. So this theory takes the mind seriously and takes science seriously. So that's what we want. We have seen some arguments against the identity theory. The argument has been, those arguments have been rejected, so that's good. So it's critical, a critical review of the identity theory, but it has one big problem. It looks like the mind is multiple realizable. So that means you could disagree there, all right? So you could say, well, fish don't have pain. You could be a Cartesian about that, or at least that, not a dualist, but someone says, well, only human beings have mental states. For instance, if you would claim that you need a language for that. So I'm just giving some suggestion here. So, but most people, I think, do agree that it's very plausible that other animals also have mental states. They're also thirsty, for instance. Why else would a dog drink, or a cow? So it looks like other animals can have mental states as well. They have different brains, so it looks like the mind is multiply realizable. The argument for multiple realizability might not be fatal to the identity theory, even though many people do believe that. And in next lecture, we'll take a look at a materialist view, a physicalist view, that accepts the multiple realizability of the mind. This theory is the theory of functionalism. So it also answers the question, how does the conscious mind fit in a physical world in a materialist way? That is, it accepts mind-body supervenience. So you need matter to have in mind. But they claim that the identity theory is false because, well, it makes this too strong a claim that mental states are identical to certain brain states. What you should say is that mental states can be realized by certain brain states. And that is what the functionists take seriously. So next time we'll take a look at the details of that theory, and of course we are going to evaluate that as well. So one thing, of course, that should be clear is that many people believe that the argument of multiple realizability against the identity theory is fatal to the theory, but there are still people defending the identity theory that try to show that it's not the case. That was with the counter argument number 3 I just briefly mentioned, and I will in some way present to you in more detail in a tutorial, in a knowledge clip or something like that. Next time in the lecture, we'll look at functionalism, which thus is a materialist view that also takes mind supervenience, mind-body supervenience, seriously. It accepts that, but it interprets supervenience not as identity, but as realization.
That's it for lecture 3. Stay safe.